Chapter 14, the Directory, 1795 to 1799. The problem facing the convention in the summer of 1795 was now very clear. Having routed the forces of both terrorism and royalism, it had to devise a constitution for the country which would prevent the recovery of either. All the deputies agreed that what France needed most was stability, but they also believed that stability could and should be achieved without sacrificing the principles of 1789. The ideals which their countrymen had endured so many years of torment and turmoil to establish and preserve. The principles of 1789 were not to be confused with those of 1793. The Constitution of that year declared Boissy d'Anglas, introducing the report of the drafting committee on 23rd June, had been drafted by schemers, dictated by tyranny, and accepted through terror, nothing other than the organization of anarchy. It had no redeeming features. Civil equality, in fact, he went on, is all that a reasonable man can claim. Absolute equality is a chimera. For it to exist, there would have to be absolute equality in intelligence, virtue, physical strength, education, and fortune for all men. We must be governed by the best. The best are those who are best educated and most interested in the maintenance of the laws. Yet, with very few exceptions, you find such men only among those who, owning a piece of property, are devoted to the country that contains it, to the laws that protect it, to the tranquility that maintains it, and who, to this property and to the economic security it provides, the education that has made them capable of discussing with wisdom and exactitude the advantages and inconveniences of the laws that determine the fate of their native land. The man without property, on the other hand, requires a constant exercise of virtue to interest himself in a social order that preserves nothing for him, and to resist actions and movements that hold out hope to him. A country governed by non-proprietors is a state of nature. This principles underlay the new Constitution, finally approved by the convention on 22nd August. It was headed by a Declaration of Rights, like its predecessors, but there was no mention of equality of birth or entitlement to social services. And the 22 rights enunciated were balanced by 9 specific duties. all male taxpayers over 21 were declared citizens with voting rights, but deputies would be chosen by electoral assemblies, to which only citizens owning or renting, according to constituency size, property worth between 100 and 200 days' labor were eligible. This produced a notional pool of almost a million, a third of that of 1789, from which to choose about 30,000 electoral college members. Elections would be annual, renewing a third of the deputies each time, but the legislature, for the first time, would be bicameral. Experience since 1789 had borne out all the warnings of the monarchians, so heedlessly brushed aside then about the dangers of a single chamber. A constitution of elaborate checks and balances was now the aim. Thus, there would be two councils, the lower, or Council of 500, would initiate all legislation. The upper, the Council of Elders, with 250 members, married or widowed, over 40, could merely pass or reject legislation coming from the 500. Executive power, now that the restoration of a king was out of the question, would be vested in 5 directors, chosen by the elders from a list presented by the 500. One of them would retire each year by lot. Neither they nor the ministers they appointed could sit in the legislature. Here was a principle of 1789 that the experience of the year 2 seemed to underline the wisdom of. Finally, the Constitution of the year 3 was deliberately made very difficult to change. The procedures envisaged could not take less than 9 years. The aim, again, was to maximize the stability of the new regime and make any changes in the direction of either extreme ipso facto illegal. But even this was not enough entirely to reassure the members of the convention that their intentions would be observed. The transition to the new order needed some continuity. They look back on the self-denying ordinance of 1791, moved, of course, by Robespierre, as one of the Constituent Assembly's crowning mistakes. They therefore accompanied the Constitution with decrees stipulating that 2/3 of the members of the first councils to be elected under it should be drawn from their own ranks. The two-thirds law came as a shock to public opinion. By now, there was a general weariness with the convention and its posturings. Shortages of basic commodities and inflation of the assignats continued throughout the summer, and the deputies were not entirely unreasonably blamed. When on 10th August a festival was held to commemorate the third anniversary of the overthrow of the monarchy, it was coldly received. Market women, noted a police spy, said it would have been better to do something about bringing down the price of things instead of holding useless and expensive festivals. But at least the drafting of a constitution meant that the country would soon be rid of the convention. The two-thirds law blighted these hopes. It also deprived monarchists who hoped to show their strength in the elections of the prospect of an early victory. The extent of the disappointment was shown when, early in September, the Constitution and the two-thirds law were submitted for ratification to the primary electoral assemblies. The Constitution was accepted by an official 1,057,000 votes to 49,000, although perhaps 200,000 more actually voted. The turnout was lower than in 1793, but still respectable enough. There was enormous confusion about the two-thirds law, however. It was widely unpopular when it was considered at all by the electoral assemblies. And even the almost meaningless official result could not conjure up more than 200,000 votes in favor out of a mere 314,000 recorded at cast. Almost a quarter of departments opposed it, and in Paris all but one of the 48 sections were against. Metropolitan hostility reflected the thorough purging of the sections that had gone on since Prairial, in which all suspected terrorists had been arrested, leaving conservatives in uncontested control. The vote against the law followed a noisy campaign by right-wing newspapers, which alerted the convention to the danger. And early in September, it began to take countervailing action by releasing Jacobin suspects and summoning troops to Paris. These moves were taken as evidence that the Constitution was to be imposed by force, and possibly with terrorist support. The hostile clamor only increased. When the results of the votes were announced on 23rd September, first Vendémiaire, a number of unanimous Parisian returns were discounted on the grounds that precise figures had not been stated. After that, several of the city's western sections began to organize for an insurrection. Their primary assemblies refusing the convention's instructions to disband and concerting defiant denunciations of its ballot rigging. On 3rd October, a royalist riot at Dreux, 40 miles to the west, was dispersed with violence. When news of the incident reached the capital the next day, a call was issued for representatives of all the sections to meet to plan joint action. Only 15 appeared, an ominously tepid turnout, and even then no action was agreed. The convention hurriedly outlawed such meetings and stationed troops with cannon at strong points throughout the city. Even so, on the morning of October the 4th, 12th of Vendémiaire, 7 sections declared themselves to be in insurrection and mobilized their National Guard units. Regular soldiers sent that evening against Section Le Pelletier, the Centre of Resistance, accepted promises of disarmament and withdrew. The promises were not kept. The next morning, therefore, 25,000 insurgents converged on the convention, mostly from south of the river. They were stopped by troops who had invested the main bridges on the orders of the deputy Barras, advised in turn by the 26-year-old artillery general Bonaparte. All afternoon, the two sides faced each other, but at 4:30, the convention's cannon opened fire. The insurgents had no cannon. Indeed, so effectively had Paris been disarmed after Prairial that even those who had rifles were short of powder and shot. Nevertheless, the convention had only 6,000 troops, and once the fighting had begun, rebel sections north of the river threw their forces into the balance, and the battle lasted 6.5 hours. Isolated skirmishes continued until the morning of the 6th. It took more than the few shells vaunted by Bonaparte to win the day for the convention, and when it was over, hundreds lay dead. It was the last time Paris attempted to impose its will on the national representatives, and although troops had been prominent in mopping up after Prairial. It was the first time the army had been unleashed against unrest in the capital since the Réveillon riots of April 1789. The Vendémiaire uprising was therefore much more of a turning point than the end of the convention and inauguration of the Constitution of the year 3, which took place 3 weeks later on 27 October. The one clear aim of the rebels had been to prevent the operation of the two-thirds law in the elections scheduled for the second week in October. Their failure meant that 500 members of the convention duly took their seats, although only 394 by election. In the new councils, from where they could prolong the spirit and policies of the Thermidorian Convention until reduced to a minority in the spring elections of 1797. The first directors chosen were not surprisingly from their ranks, too. Barras, a slippery ex-noble, was a natural choice after his role in Vendémiaire. Sieyès was now resurfaced after years of prudent silence, but refused to preside over a system not of his own devising. His place was taken by Carnot, whose prestige as a military organizer outweighed his terroristic record. La Réveillère, Les Pieux, Rubel, and Le Tourneur were as yet unknown quantities, chosen for their republicanism, thus far more proven than their abilities. The policy they would pursue remained that which had emerged over the summer of 1795. When Jacobinism threatened, clubs would be closed and suspected terrorists rounded up, as after Prairial. When royalism seemed the danger, curbs would be imposed on the well-funded right-wing press, while Jacobin papers would receive subsidies. Sans-culottes in detention would be released and encouraged to open clubs. Clemency to the recently execrated terrorists marked the convention's response to the Vendémiaire crisis, both in the build-up to the insurrection and in its aftermath. Indeed, rumors of the renewed favor enjoyed by Jacobins did much to help precipitate the rising, and some newly released veterans of Prairial served as volunteers alongside Barras soldiers. Yet, the repression after Vendémiaire did not match that after Prairial. No efforts were made to prevent known ringleaders fleeing the city, and only 2 of those arrested were executed. For despite the convention's propaganda, It was far from certain that most of those involved were royalists. Much clearer was that they included many people of property and substance, who might be wooed from their leanings towards monarchy if the new constitution could provide the security they craved. The most resolute steps taken after Vendémiaire, therefore, struck not at those involved at the apparatus which both they and their sans-culotte predecessors had used to mount insurrections ever since 1792. Thus, on 10th October, sectional assemblies were abolished, along with the National Guard organization, which they had controlled. A new, centrally controlled Parisian Guard took its place, designed to be an instrument of the government rather than the governed. It was now clear above all, however, that the supreme instrument of government, at home as well as abroad, was the army. True, the Constitution excluded all regular troops from a radius of 60 kilometers round the capital, but the Directory could not have begun as its architects intended without military help. And it was soon recognized that it needed that help to survive, too. The most pressing problems facing the directors as they installed themselves in the chilly, dilapidated, and unfurnished Luxembourg Palace on the 1st November were economic. The harvest of 1795 brought little relief to the famine conditions of the spring. The savage winter meant grain was sown late, and it failed to swell during the usually dry summer, while the British blockade disrupted imports from overseas. The best of domestic produce continued to be requisitioned for the armies. All basic foodstuffs, candles, and firewood were strictly rationed, although the black market flourished, and the first frosts of what was to be another exceptionally cold winter arrived early, at the beginning of November. On top of all this came the final catastrophic collapse of the assignats. They had reached 1% of their face value by the time the Directory began. A month later, the Paris bread was costing 50 livres a pound, butter 100, coffee 250, soap 170. The price of everything is excessive, noted a Parisian diarist. No more order, no more supervision. Everybody free to sell what he has for whatever he wants. It really seems as if the time has come at last to die of hunger and cold, lacking everything. Great God, what a republic. And the worst of it is, one can't tell when or how it will end. Everybody is dying of hunger. On 19 October, the floor of the printing house where assignats were produced collapsed with the activity of the presses, which were turning out 2,000 millions worth of paper money per month. Specie had completely disappeared. On arriving in Normandy in February 1796, the Irish revolutionary Wolfe Tone noticed that coinage was actually refused on the presumption that it could not be genuine. Landlords had in any case been authorized to take half their rents in kind since the summer, and the salaries of the directors themselves and other public officials were expressed in the Constitution in measures of grain rather than money. Debtors did well in these circumstances, paying off their creditors in currency worth quite literally less than the paper it was printed on. The greatest debtor of all was the government itself, simply meeting its commitments by printing what was required. But the government was also a creditor, receiving only its own worthless paper back in taxes, despite attempts to make taxpayers account for half in cash or kind. Even a war rate, 25th October, designed simply to mop up surplus assignats by demanding a paper contribution 20 times the value of assessed taxes, made no impact on the problem, while a forced loan in a specie decreed 6 weeks later in order to draw hoarded coinage back into circulation to the tune of 600 millions, had only yielded 116 millions 4 months later. Much of that had come in the end in the form of discounted assignats, which were at once reissued. There were over 34 billion livres worth still in circulation when, in February 1796, it was finally decided to print no more. On the 19th, a solemn public bonfire of the broken plates used to produce them was lit in the Place Vendôme. Yet, even supposing this gesture succeeded, returning to specie would take time. To bridge the gap, it was at first proposed to establish a land bank issuing notes on the credit of still unsold national lands. Rommel, the newly appointed finance minister, had been well connected in banking circles since before 1789. and now tried to put together a consortium of financiers to launch the new institution. But the suspicion of banks, which had kept France without one since the great crash of 1720, was still virulent, especially in Jacobin circles eternally hostile to speculators. A furious journalistic campaign led by Lindet, who had managed the controlled economy of the year 2 and now ran a newspaper, L'Ami des Lois, led to the scheme's rejection by the councils. Instead, they adopted what were in effect the assignats by another name, the territorial mandates, redeemable in national lands or in assignats still in circulation at the rate of 30 to 1. But their value in relation to land was fixed at the levels of 1790, long undermined by the unprecedented amount of property thrown onto the market during the intervening years. Moreover, 3 times as many were issued at the entire face value of the assignats still in circulation. The result was that even on their first day of issue, they were being discounted at 18% of their face value, and by midsummer, they were as worthless as the assignats, ceasing to be legal tender on 17 July. In 4 months, they had run the course which took the assignats 5 years. But those months proved a remarkable opportunity for speculators in national property who bought in worthless paper and resold or leased for cash. Far more of a profiteer's paradise than the bank which deputies as yet refused to countenance. Enormous profits were also made by the private company which contracted to withdraw the remaining paper from circulation over the winter of 1796 and 97. But by 4th of February 1797, when the mandates were officially demonetized, the revolutionary experiment with paper money was at an end. The speculative fortunes being made in these chaotic conditions could only reinforce resentment at the privations of ordinary people who were forced to endure for a second exceptionally lean year. Such popular discontents, in turn, were fertile soil for the Jacobins, whose fortunes continued to revive rapidly in the aftermath of Vendémiaire. Although 68 terrorist deputies suspected of being too left-wing had on 22nd August been declared ineligible for the directorial councils, they were not excluded from other political activity. Others joined them when an amnesty proclaimed to mark the start of the Directory brought the release from prison of the remainder of those arrested after Prairial. They were soon meeting regularly, and Jacobin journalists like Lindet or Duval, publisher of the Journal des Hommes Libres, found that discreet governmental subsidies were available. They were even allowed to establish a club. The Pantheon Club was founded on 16 November and was soon able to boast over 1,000 members. The next day, the most eloquent journalistic agitator of the previous year, Babeuf, began once more to produce his Tribune du Peuple. But whereas many Jacobins were prepared to accept favors from a government that seemed at least firmly Republican, Babeuf was intransigent from the very moment of his release under the amnesty. What, he asked, is the French Revolution? An open war between patricians and plebeians, between rich and poor. Until the fall of Robespierre, the poor had made considerable progress in this struggle. Since then, it had been one long retreat. But now, Babeuf went even further. During his months in prison, he had come to the conclusion that there would be no true equality among men until property itself was abolished. Common ownership and equal distribution of goods should be the proper aim of the state, which it should pursue, if necessary, by terroristic methods far more fierce than any seen in France so far. Meanwhile, the first step would be to implement the Constitution of 1793, and it was this now classic demand, rather than the full-blooded communism of which he was the first active exponent in modern times, that struck the most immediate chords with Babeuf's contemporaries. Within weeks, the Tribune du Peuple was selling 2,000 copies and was being read not only in Paris clubs and cafes, but in circles composed of former terrorists in provincial towns all over northern France, and some much further afield. After only 2 issues, the government tried to arrest the author, but sans-culotte sympathizers spirited him into hiding, from where he continued to produce the journal. As much of his fury was directed against the fickleness of his fellow Jacobins as against the Directory, and for a time that cut him off from the Pantheon Club and other groups prepared to rub along with the new regime. But when his wife was arrested for distributing the paper, Jacobin opinion in general swung his way, and Her release after 3 weeks failed to reopen the division. By the middle of February 1796, the Pantheon Club was giving thunderous applause to readings of Babeuf's journal, which denounced the directors as tyrants. At the theaters, fierce patriotic pieces sustained these sentiments. "I never knew what enthusiasm was before," noted the newly arrived Wolfe Tone, moved to tears. Understanding no French, he little knew that the ballots he was attending were a form of Jacobin rally. Lindet's campaign against the proposed bank, along with vocal popular resentment against steadily diminishing bread and meat rations, began to look like a coordinated challenge to government. "It's a fine bugger of a republic for robbers," shouted women queuing outside a wine shop on 10 February. "First they guillotine us, now they make us die of hunger. What's more, Robespierre didn't let us waste away. He only brought death to the rich. This lot are letting people die every day." In fact, the policy of conciliating the Jacobins to keep the monarchists at bay seemed to be getting beyond control. And on 27 February, it was brusquely reversed. 5 clubs and a theater were closed, including the Pantheon, cleared by soldiers under the command of Bonaparte. A few days later, a purge began to clear Jacobin suspects from posts of authority. And on 16 April, advocacy of the Constitution of 1793 was made a capital crime. Faced with renewed persecution from a regime some had hoped they could live with, the Jacobins now turned instinctively to insurrection. But a classic sans-culotte journée was out of the question. The machinery through which such mass demonstrations had been put together no longer existed. Even the 48 sections had now been replaced by 12 more amorphous arrondissements. During his months in prison, however, Babeuf had become increasingly attracted by the idea of seizing power by a coup d'etat rather than mass confrontation. In the course of March and April, he and a group of victims of the year number 2, including Buonarroti, once a middle-ranking official of the Terror, later to achieve fame as the chronicler of his conspiracy, established an insurrectional committee. Its aim was to coordinate the energies of Democrats throughout the capital and secretly to subvert the police legion. The police legion, which had now replaced the National Guard as the main force of law and order in the city. Approaches were also planned to military units. The idea was that when the signal was given for a rising, there could be no resistance, since the forces of order would join it. An insurrectionary act was prepared and even printed. It proclaimed in the name of equality, liberty, and the common happiness that sovereignty had been usurped by a faction of conspirators. The members of the convention who still dominated the councils, whom French Democrats now intended to overthrow and judge. Once in power, the equals would bring into effect the Constitution of 1793, organize free distributions of bread, and implement the laws of Ventose Year II to distribute national lands to needy patriots. There would be no mercy to the usurpers. Heads, gloated one veteran of the terror, would fall like hail with tripes and bowels scattered about the pavement. But before these vengeful fantasies could be fulfilled, the conspiracy was betrayed by one of its own members, along with the hiding place of Babeuf and other leading equals. They had already lost perhaps their best opportunity to strike, when on 28 April, certain units of the Polish Legion mutinied. They insisted that their Day of the People must remain 19 May. So the mutiny was put down, eventually with 17 executions. And on 10 May, Babeuf and Buonarroti were arrested. Other equals were brought in on subsequent days. Altogether, there were 128 arrests, 48 of them in the provinces. The ringleaders were imprisoned, like the tyrant whose memory they so much execrated in the temple. It was the spring of 1797 before they were brought to trial. Carnot, the director responsible for smashing the conspiracy, was determined to secure convictions at all costs. In the excuse that one of the conspirators was a deputy, Drouet, the man who had identified Louis XVI at Varennes, was used to send all of them before a specially constituted high court. Drouet escaped in August, but arrangements went ahead for the court to sit at Vendôme. Far from the Paris populace, the plotters had hoped to propel into action. In the meantime, the exposure of the conspiracy brought further anti-Jacobin repression. The subscription list of the Tribune du Peuple, found among Babeuf's papers, provided an obvious roll call of suspects who were duly harassed and removed from any positions of influence they might hold. The suspect police legion was dissolved. Another step towards making the government completely dependent on the UMI. But was the UMI reliable? Babeuf and his fellow conspirators had always believed the troops could be subverted. And that belief continued in Jacobin circles even after the conspiracy's collapse. 10,000 bored and underpaid troops were encamped at Grenelle, near the Champ de Mars, dreaming enviously of comrades, now winning spectacular and glorious victories in Italy and being paid by their general in plundered coin. Rumors of mutiny among them circulated throughout the summer, and dubious elements were periodically discharged. But when on 9 September, several hundred Jacobins marched to Grenelle expecting a dragoon regiment to defect to them, informers in their ranks had alerted the authorities, and the soldiers charged the marchers with drawn swords. 20 were cut to pieces, and another 30 of those arrested then or subsequently were shot after military trials. But by then, Babeuf and his co-conspirators, secure in iron cages on wheels, had been transported to Vendôme to face less summary, but the directors hoped, just as inevitable justice. The rout of the Jacobins could not fail to encourage monarchists of every stripe. They certainly had little enough to cheer them on other fronts. Their foreign friends were either deserting them, like the British, who were putting out peace feelers, or being defeated in the field, like the Austrians in Italy. The royalist rebellions in the Vendée and Brittany were now in the final stages of being stifled by Hoche. It was true that white terror continued to make life unsafe for those with Jacobin pasts throughout the southeast, and that the British spy master Wickham in Switzerland and D'Entraigues in Italy entertained high hopes that some movement might come together out of the random vengeance killings that went on all the time in a region where vendetta had long been a way of life. Mallet Dupin characteristically saw more clearly. The South, he wrote, is in ferment, but its agitation is vague, without ends or means. The people of Arles, noted a local observer in January 1796, taken up entirely with themselves and little indeed with the public interest, have contracted the habit of concentrating great national concerns in their personal passions and feelings. For them, revolutionary crises have not been this or that event favorable or disastrous to liberty, but ways of letting one party prevail over another. In such circumstances, monarchists hoping to recapture the state increasingly pin their hopes on winning elections. The next ones were scheduled for the spring of 1797, and already a number of deputies who were not ex-members of the convention were discussing how the reduction of the latter to a minority could be turned to monarchist advantage. They met regularly in the prosperous suburb city of Clichy, first emerging in the Thermidorian times. This Clichy club was understandably quiescent in the aftermath of Vendémiaire, but now it took on new life. A well-funded and outspoken right-wing press, several of whose editors were regular attenders at Clichy, used renewed government complacence to emphasize the coming opportunity. It was true that there was no real unity on the right, or even within the Clichy Club. Absolute monarchists hated constitutionalists and only cooperated with them in order to use them. Constitutionalists in turn could be subdivided into those hoping for concessions from Louis XVIII and Orleanists, who placed more hope in the junior branch of the royal house represented by Louis Philippe, the émigré son of Philippe Égalité, a king who was himself the son of a regicide might, Legitimus feared, be an attractive prospect to the regicides who still dominated politics. If their republic should fail, even so, all royalists believed by the autumn of 1796 that events were moving their way, and most were content to cooperate in winning the elections, leaving decisions about subsequent policy until later. While newspapers and pamphleteers hammered home the inadequacies of the Republic, its contempt for the law, and above all, its economic and financial incompetence, something like a party organization grew up with the establishment of semi-secret royalist clubs, calling themselves the Philanthropic Institute. Beginning in Bordeaux, they soon spread throughout the South, and at their height were active in perhaps 70 departments, some of them receiving secret British funds. the self-styled Friends of Order, who made up their membership, played assiduously upon the fears of the men of substance who would be casting their votes in April 1797. But their efforts were undermined by the activities of an inner circle of legitimate sons who still toyed with more violent means. The futility of that was, however, demonstrated as the year began when a royalist version of the Grenelle plot to subvert troops stationed near Paris was revealed by informers. Brotier, the chief agent of d'Entraigues' network in the capital, was arrested, along with several key members of his organization at the end of January. They were at once subjected to a show trial, running concurrently with that of Babeuf, which finally began in Vendôme on 20th February. The twin dangers facing the Republic were thus graphically displayed side by side. And in addition, for the first time during the Revolution, the government resorted to systematic electioneering on its own behalf. Under the Constitution, each department was administered by a 5-man elected administration, subject in turn to the surveillance of a centrally appointed directorial commissioner, modeled on the national agent employed under the revolutionary government of the year number 2. In disturbed departments of the West or along the Rhone Valley, departmental administrations had never been elected from the start and were regularly remodeled according to each swing of the pendulum in Paris. In the first 3 months of 1796, 11 departments had their personnel totally or partially renewed to remove Jacobinical influences. During the spring of the subsequent year, this network of officials was directed to use all its influence to see that the electoral assemblies returned solid, middle-of-the-road Republicans. On 25th February, it was decreed that only émigrés whose names had been removed from the official list might vote, sketching plans for a mass return to participate in the elections. While in March, an oath to defend the Constitution against both monarchists and anarchists was imposed on all members of electoral assemblies. The right was alarmed at these confident directorial ploys, as well as denouncing them furiously in the press. Its leaders begged Louis XVIII to make some gesture to reassure propertied waverers before the assemblies met. Eventually, on 10th March, he issued a grudging declaration from Blankenberg, full of ambiguity, urging Frenchmen to vote decisively against Jacobinism and holding out the vaguest hope that the Declaration of Verona had not, after all, been his last word